Verses 26 to 30. God hardened them wonderfully by his signal appearances for them. v. 26. There was immediately a great earthquake. How far it extended we are not told, but it was such a violent shock in this place that the very foundations of the prison were shaken. While the prisoners were hearkening to the midnight devotions of Paul and Silas, and perhaps laughing at them and making a jest of them, this earthquake would strike a terror upon them, and convince them that those men were the favorites of heaven, and such as God owned. We had the house of prayer shaken, in answer to prayer, and as a token of God's acceptance of it. Ch. 431. Here the prison shaken. The Lord was in these earthquakes, to show his resentment of the indignities done to his servants, to testify to those whose confidence is in the earth the weakness and instability of that which they confide, and to teach people that, though the earth be moved, yet they need not fear. The prison doors were thrown open, and the prisoners' fetters were knocked off, every man's bands were loosed. Perhaps the prisoners, when they heard Paul and Silas pray and sing psalms, admired them, and spoke honorably of them, and said what the damsel had said of them, surely, these men are the servants of the living God. To recompense them for, and confirm them in, their good opinion of them, they share in the miracle, and have their bands loosed, as afterwards God gave to Paul all those that were in the ship with him. Ch. 27:24. So now he gave him all those that were in the prison with him. God hereby signified to these prisoners, as Grotius observes, that the apostles, in preaching the gospel, were public blessings to mankind, as they proclaimed liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison doors to those that were bound. Isa 61:1. Et per eos salvi animorum vincula, and as by them the bonds of souls were unloosed. The persecutors designed to stop the progress of the gospel, that no more might embrace it. Thus they hoped to ruin the meeting by the riverside, that no more hearts should be opened there. But here we find converts made in the prison, that house turned into a meeting, the trophies of the gospel's victories erected there, and the jailer, their own servant, become a servant of Christ. It is probable that some of the prisoners, if not all, were converted. Surely the miracle wrought on their bodies, in loosing their bands, was wrought on their souls too. See Job 36:8-10, PS 107:14-15. But it is only the conversion of the jailer that is recorded. He is afraid he shall lose his life, and Paul makes him easy as to this care. v. 27:28. He awoke out of his sleep. It is probable that the shock of the earthquake woke him, and the opening of the prison doors, and the prisoners' expressions of joy and amazement, when in the dark they found their bands loosed, and called to tell one another what they felt. This was enough to awaken the jailer, whose place required that he should not be hard to wake. This waking him out of his sleep signified the awakening of his conscience out of its spiritual slumber. The call of the gospel is, "Awake, thou that sleepest," F 5:14, like that of Jonah, 1:6. He saw the prison doors open, and supposed, as well he might, that the prisoners had fled, and then what would become of him? He knew the Roman law in that case, and it was executed not long ago upon the keepers out of whose hands Peter escaped. Ch. 12:19. It was according to that of the prophet, 1 Key 20:39-42, "Keep this man, if he be missing, thy life shall go for his life." The Roman lawyers after this, in their readings upon the law, de custodiariorum, the custody of criminals, which appoints that the keeper should undergo the same punishment that should have been inflicted on the prisoner if he let him escape, take care to accept an escape by miracle. In his fright he drew his sword, and was going to kill himself, to prevent a more terrible death, an expected one, a pompous ignominious death, which he knew he was liable to for letting his prisoners escape and not looking better to them, and the extraordinarily strict charge which the magistrates gave him concerning Paul and Silas made him conclude they would be very severe upon him if they were gone. The philosophers generally allowed self-murder. Seneca prescribes it as the last remedy which those that are in distress may have recourse to. The Stoics, notwithstanding their pretended conquest of the passions, yielded thus far to them. And the Epicureans, who indulged the pleasures of sense, to avoid its pains chose rather to put an end to it. This jailer thought there was no harm in anticipating his own death, but Christianity proves itself to be of God by this, that it keeps us to the law of our creation, revives, enforces, and establishes it, obliges us to be just to our own lives, and teaches us cheerfully to resign them to our graces, but courageously to hold them out against our corruptions. Paul stopped him from his proceeding against himself. v. 28 He cried with a loud voice, not only to make him hear, but to make him heed, saying, Do not practice any evil to thyself, do thyself no harm. All the cautions of the word of God against sin, and all appearances of it and approaches to it, have this tendency, do thyself no harm. Man, woman, do not wrong thyself, nor ruin thyself, hurt not thyself, and then none else can hurt thee, do not sin, for nothing else can hurt thee. Even as to the body, we are cautioned against those sins which do harm to it, and are taught to hate our own flesh, but to nourish and cherish it. The jailer needs not fear being called to an account for the escape of his prisoners, for they are all here. It was strange that some of them did not slip away, when the prison doors were opened, and they were loosed from their bands, but their amazement held them fast, and, being sensible it was by the prayers of Paul and Silas that they were loosed, they would not stir unless they stirred, and God showed his power in binding their spirits, as much as in loosing their feet. He is afraid he shall lose his soul, and Paul makes him easy as to this care too. One concern leads him to another, and a much greater, and, being hindered from hastening himself out of this world, he begins to think, if he had pursued his intention, whither death would have brought him, and what would have become of him on the other side. Death, a very proper thought for such as have been snatched as a brand out of the fire, when there was but a step between them and death. Perhaps the heinousness of the sin he was running into helped to alarm him. Whatever was the cause, he was put into a great consternation. The Spirit of God, that was sent to convince, in order to his being a comforter, struck a terror upon him, and startled him. Whether he took care to shut the prison doors again we are not told. Perhaps he forgot this as the woman of Samaria, when Christ had impressed convictions on her conscience, left her water pot and forgot her errand to the well, for he called for a light with all speed, and sprang into the inner prison, and came trembling to Paul and Silas. Those that have sin set in order before them, and are made to know their abominations, cannot but tremble at the apprehension of their misery and danger. This jailer, when he was thus made to tremble, could not apply to a more proper person than to Paul, for it had once been his own case. He had been once a persecutor of good men, as this jailer had cast them into prison, as he kept them, and when, like him, he was made sensible of it, he trembled, and was astonished, and therefore he was able to speak the more feelingly to the jailer. In this consternation, he applied to Paul and Silas for relief. How reverent and respectful his address to them is! He called for a light, because they were in the dark, and that they might see what a fright he was in. He fell down before them, as one amazed at the badness of his own condition, and ready to sink under the load of his terror because of it. He fell down before them, as one that had upon his spirit an awe of them, and of the image of God upon them, and of their commission from God. It is probable that he had heard what the damsel said of them, that they were the servants of the living God, who showed to them the way of salvation, and as such he thus expressed his veneration for them. He fell down before them, to beg their pardon, as a penitent, for the indignities he had done them, and to beg their advice, as a supplicant, what he should do. He gave them a title of respect, Sirs, Kyrioi lords, masters. Just now it was, rogues and villains, and he was their master, but now, sirs, lords, and they are his masters. Converting grace changes people's language of and to good people and good ministers, and, to such as are thoroughly convinced of sin, the very feet of those that bring tidings of Christ are beautiful, yet, though they are disgracefully fastened in the stocks. How serious his inquiry is, what must I do to be saved? First, his salvation is now his great concern, and lies nearest his heart, which before was the furthest thing from his thoughts. Not, what shall I do to be preferred, to be rich and great in the world? But, what shall I do to be saved? Secondly, he does not inquire concerning others, what they must do, but concerning himself, what must I do? It is his own precious soul that he is in care about. Let others do as they please, tell me what I must do, what course I must take. Thirdly, he is convinced that something must be done, and done by him too, in order to his salvation, that it is not a thing of course, a thing that will do itself, but a thing about which we must strive, wrestle, and take pains. He asks not, what may be done for me? But, what shall I do, that, being now in fear and trembling, I may work out my salvation? As Paul speaks in his epistle to the church at Philippi, of which this jailer was, perhaps with respect to his trembling inquiry here, intimating that he must not only ask after salvation, as he had done, but work out his salvation with a holy trembling. Philosophy 2:12. Fourthly, he is willing to do anything, tell me what I must do, and I am here ready to do it. Sirs, put me into any way, if it be but the right way, and a sure way, though narrow, and thorny, and uphill, yet I will walk in it. Note, those who are thoroughly convinced of sin, and truly concerned about their salvation, will surrender at discretion to Jesus Christ, will give him a blank to write what he pleases, will be glad to have Christ upon his own terms, Christ upon any terms. Fifthly, he is inquisitive what he should do, is desirous to know what he should do, and asks those that were likely to tell him. If you will inquire, inquire yet. Isa 21:12. Those that set their faces Zionward must ask the way thither. Jah 50:5. We cannot know it of ourselves, but God has made it known to us by his word, has appointed his ministers to assist us in consulting the scriptures, and has promised to give his Holy Spirit to those that ask him, to be their guide in the way of salvation. Sixthly, he brought them out, to put this question to them, that their answer might not be by duress or compulsion, but that they might prescribe to him, though he was their keeper, with the same liberty as they did to others. He brings them out of the dungeon, in hopes they will bring him out of a much worse.